Hi guys, I would like today to take a shot at explaining pretty difficult topic of corresponding squares in pawn endgames. Sometimes you can use them in different endgames, but mostly it's in pawn endgames. I find it brilliant, beautiful and difficult, but hopefully I can make it easier for you to understand, providing my explanations. I remember the first time I got to discover those for myself, I was shocked, I was surprised, I couldn't believe how illogical and yet brilliant this topic is. So this topic is more comprehensive than just opposition or, let's say, triangulation. It's general, it includes all of those things. So let's take a look at this pawn endgame. So white has a good solid passed pawn, right? And white is clearly pressing. So what white can do to win this one? At first you try the easiest approach. You try to push a pawn, takes king f7, nothing happens, opposition, king g5, king g7. It's equal, right? So then you maybe think, okay, let me go around through h4. I'm just gonna go to h4 and try to go from the side. So you go king g3, black goes king g7. You try to go through h4 and black goes king g6. Hopefully here you can realize that this is the only square for that guy to be. It cannot be on h6 because the pawn will promote, right? And it cannot be on f6 because then you would just go to h5 and then you would approach, he would be in Zugzwang, you would approach to g5. So now you understand that if your king is here, his king has to be here. And another really good question to ask yourself in pawn endgames, sometimes in other kind of endgames, is what if it was his move? Let me see, does it make any difference? So if it was black to move, black would lose, right? So let's say black went king g6 here, white goes king h4. It's black to move. What should black do? This king has to stay in the square of a passed pawn, right? So cannot go to h6. If he goes to f6, you go to h5, and then we just go and eat this pawn and win the game, right? So it's Zugzwang. In the starting position, what if it was black to move here? Let's say I go king g3, king g7, I go king f3, king f3, and he goes king f6, I go king f4. Let's say it's black to move. Now black is losing. Black cannot lose the pawn. Black has to go to g6. Now we go e7, king f7, king f5, king e7, king g6, and white is winning because king will reach the d6 square. If we shift the position one row below, that would be a draw, but this one is a win. I do hope you know this. So all right, so we established that if in this position it's black to move, white wins. If in this position it's black to move, white wins again. This is how you establish which squares correspond to each other. In a way, they are mind squares. The first one to step on it may lose a half a point. So you realize that if white goes to f4, black has to be on f6. You go to h4, black king has to be on g6, but only after you go to corresponding square. Now let's see what happens. I would go to g3. So from this location, I am able to go here where the only square to be for my opponent is f6. And if I go to h4, the only square for him to hold is g6. Right? So white can reach these two squares immediately from g3. Where should black king be to also immediately reach those two squares? Let's take a look. f7 is taken by the pawn, so black's king has to be able to immediately jump to f6 if white chooses the f4 square, and g6 if white chooses to go to h4 square. It means that the only square to be for the king is g7. Take a look. If white goes to f4, black goes to f6. White goes to h4, black goes to g6. Right? Only square to be. Now, same question. What if it was black to move in this position? Let me just do it somehow that it's black to move in this position. I'm gonna go king f3, and let's say black goes king g7, I go king g3. Now it's black to move. What happens? So again, the king has to stay in the square. It cannot go anywhere else. So where should that king go? If it goes backwards, white just win the pawn, right? So if black goes to f6, where do we go? To the square that is related, corresponding square to the f6 one. We go to f4, and now black is in Zugzwang. Cannot lose the pawn, has to go here. We've seen this variation before. Now our pawn goes, and now we go around, and eventually we win this pawn and promote our pawn. So if in this position it's black to move and black chooses f6, we go to f4. Actually, this is some sort of weird opposition where it should be your opponent's move. He should be the first one to choose. If black chooses g6 square, guess where we go? Right, we go the opposite direction to the corresponding square to g6 one. And now black king has to guard the pawn, and that's why we can reach the h5 square, from where the win is pretty easy. All right, so we have established that if white's king is on g3, black's king should be on g7. This is a very comprehensive study. So, by the way, this is a study by Grigoriev, I think. So, if white king is on g3, black king has to be on g7. And if it's black to move, white wins. You should bear that in mind. So, f4 corresponds to f6. h4 corresponds to g6. And because of these two corresponding squares, now g3 corresponds to g7, because from g7 black is able to reach both those squares. Still cannot do anything. So, but let's see if white king goes to f3. Remember these corresponding squares. It is difficult, I know, but at one point, now it's not easy, I would say. Now it's natural for me to understand it, but I remember the first time I started, I was like, I couldn't get my head around it, but eventually you'll get used to it. So you remember these squares, they correspond to each other, cannot really make use of any of it. But what we remember, if it's black to move here, black loses, and it relates to any of these corresponding squares, f4 to f6, h4 to g6, g3 to g7. So let's see if white goes to f3. From f3 we can go to f4. You should remember, where should black king be? It's f6. If we go to g3, where should that king be? Or we just established on g7. So where should black king be to be able to reach those two squares immediately after white king decides? It's g6 square, right? From g6 he can go to g7 and f6. So if white goes f3, black goes g6, still fine. Black is still doing all right. Gonna promote this line. So, all right, let us come back a little bit. So f3 corresponds to g6. Let's see if white goes to h3. What happens here? If white goes to h4, where should black be? On g6. If white goes to g3, where should black be? Black should be on g7. From which square black can reach both two squares immediately? It's h6, h7 is too far away because the pawn will move. So the only square to be is f6, right? So if white goes king h3, black still goes to f6 and still holds. If we go to h4, he's stopping us. If we go to g3, he's stopping us from g7. All right, still nothing. But we can forget about these f4, f6 already, because we already moved one row below. So g3 corresponds to g7. f3, if you remember, corresponds to g6, and h3, we just established it, corresponds to f6, and same logic applies. If king f3, king g6, we know this is the position. If it's black to move, white is winning. If it's black to move, white is winning, because if king goes to f6, we go to f4, we know this one. If king goes to g7, we go to g3, already established it previously. It would be his move again, and he would have to choose a route, and we choose the other route, which is winning. So this logic applies to these three squares. f3, g3, h3 corresponds to these three squares, and if black is the first one to step on it, we step on the corresponding square. It's his time to choose, and then we win. But still we cannot make use of it. but we take it one layer below. That's ridiculously difficult, in my opinion, if you're the first time seeing it or not used to this kind of thinking. So, but what you need to bear in mind that if that position, he's the first one to step on one of these squares, we step on the corresponding one. If he goes to f6, we go to h3 and win. g7, we go to g3, g6, we go to f3. So, we take it one layer below. We go to g2. From these, we can access any of the squares on the very next move, right? So f3 corresponds to g6, h3 corresponds to f6, and g3 corresponds to g7. Where should black king be so that when we go to h3, he's able to go to f6, which is the only square to be for him, and f3 to g6, g3 to g7. All these three squares for black could be reached instantly only from f7, but there's one legal problem with f7 square, it's taken by the pawn. So actually, the winning procedure goes, we go down to g2, that's the only square which we can make use of. From there, we can access any route we want depending where he goes. So if black now, in this position, chooses the g6 square, we have a recollection, g6 corresponds to f3, now we go to f3, it's his move again. Where should he has two moves basically. If he goes to f6, that's simple, we go to f4, we've seen this one, it's his move now. Starting position, but his move. If he goes to g7, we again try recollection, which square, now we go to g3, we win the, well, imaginary opposition again, and now he has to choose. If he chooses f6, we already know what to do. If he chooses g6, we take the route from h4 and we go around, and it's his move again, and we win. So if we are standing on g2, he chooses the f6 square. We again have a recollection. Which square corresponds to it? It's only h3. If he would go to g3, he goes to g7, we didn't accomplish anything. We go around through h3, and now it's his move again. If he goes to g6, we already know this is king h4, reached the goal. If he goes to g7, we still take our time. We use the corresponding square to g7. We go to g3, his move again. Now he has to choose, and then we choose our route accordingly. And this is a winning mechanism. This is the way to win. This is the thinking mechanism of, if I'm here, he has to be there. If I'm there, he has to be here. This is much more complicated example than hopefully the one you know with the regular triangulation. This is a regular triangulation. We hopefully you know it. So if king goes to d6, he's going to d8. King goes to c5, he goes to c7. So by the logic, if I'm standing on d5, he has to be standing on c8. But if it was his move, he loses. So what do? C5 corresponds to c7, d5 corresponds to c8. So we go down c4. We want to reach this one. He has to reach c7. If he goes d5, he has to reach c8 immediately. So where should he go? He should go only to d8. But now we are waiting. We are using another square from where we can reach both of them. And if we go to d5, he has to be on c8. If we go to c5, he has to be on c7, but not the first one to step. And he has no waiting move because again d7 is taken, so he has to choose now himself. This is like much simpler example, but also of corresponding squares, just regular triangulation. But in previous example it was ridiculously difficult, but the logic of the way of thinking is similar to this one, but much more difficult. There's even more difficult one, maybe. Okay, I'll just, for fun, I would just put it. Till this day, I'm still shocked about. This is from game, also from Dvoretsky Endgame Manual. Gulko short, 1995. Gulko managed to find this one over the board, although this was not a starting position. He must have figured it previously. White to move. I would just leave you with that. There's only one move that makes a draw here for white, and Well, spoiler, if you don't want to know, pause the video or just close it. The only winning move here for white, by the way, I urge you to try to find it if you feel confident you understood this topic. I will wait before you pause. The only move to make a draw here is king g2. This is ridiculous. Till this day, I cannot believe this one. King g2 is the only move to make a draw. You can use the same algorithm as from the first example, but still even more complex than that. All right, I'm jumping from one position to the other. That was my shot at explaining corresponding squares. Please like, share, subscribe, whatever you're supposed to do to let people know about my channel. I hope you enjoyed it. I will see you most likely in a week. Goodbye.